Hey guys, it's Libby, and I had already filmed and started editing the video that I was going to post this week, but then Katie had to go and foil all of my plans by doing a video comparing Jane Eyre and Rebecca, two of my favorite books, one of my favorite booktubers. I had to do a response. I actually finished watching the video, went down to start typing a comment, and I was like, there's so much. There's just so much, and I'm too lazy to type it out, so I'm gonna words it at you. So I would suggest that you watch her video before this one, because some of the things I will be saying will be a direct response to things that she has said. And also, both my video and her video contain like all of the spoilers, so if you have not read both Rebecca and Jane Eyre, go do it. There is just way worse things you could be doing with your time. Okay, so now that you have presumably read both of those books and watched Katie's video, I'm not going to give you a primer on the plots and how they are similar, because you should already know those things. So I'm now going to focus more on the differences between Rebecca and Jane Eyre. I'll also tell you that I refer to the protagonist of Rebecca as Mrs. De Winter. So if I say Mrs. De Winter, I always mean the narrator, and I never mean Rebecca, the first Mrs. De Winter. So I think that reading Rebecca as a response to Jane Eyre is a totally valid way of reading it. I'm genuinely not sure how Daphne du Maurier intended it to be read, but the book belongs to the reader, not to the author, especially when the author is dead, I think. So looking at it from that perspective, I think it's really interesting that so similar a story could have been told, and told well, 100 years after it was originally told. And that core story is that you have two people who love each other, but they can't be together. Now, Jane Eyre is set in the Victorian era, so the barriers between the Jane-Rochester relationship are primarily social barriers. There's the fact that Rochester is already married, and then he can't divorce his wife because she would go to an insane asylum, which is no good. Then there's a difference in their social status and their economic status. Those are the primary impediments. I think a modern reader would say the fact that Rochester has been lying to Jane all this time is one of those, but Jane doesn't seem particularly bothered by the fact that he's been lying to her. She's mainly bothered just by the fact that he's married. So when Rebecca was being written in the 1930s, and it's presumably set around that time, it's definitely set after the invention of the automobile, most of these social constraints have disappeared. Divorce is now possible. There's less of an expectation that people will marry within their own socioeconomic class. There is no external reason that Mr. and Mrs. De Winter can't be together, and in fact, for all external purposes, they are. They're married and they live in the same house. They just can't be happy. And that's because of the internal barriers that they have set up. Mrs. De Winter feels like she can't and shouldn't expect, and possibly doesn't deserve, to have Maxim express his love for her because she's not very pretty and she's not charismatic. She's rather gauche, especially in comparison to Rebecca. And Maxim has to hold back from his wife, even though I think he loves her, although I can see why you would think he maybe doesn't in the text, because to him, like, really loving her would be to tell her that he is a murderer, and he's not particularly worried that this would result in him going to jail. That doesn't seem to bother him very much. It's more that this would sort of ruin Mrs. De Winter, that it might make her old and sad like him. So I think that's really the core difference between the stories. The differences between the characters are a little bit more easily summed up, and that is that, well, Rebecca is basically Jane Eyre if Jane had no self-confidence and Mr. Rochester had no empathy. I also think they're both saying something different about feminism. Jane Eyre is quite explicitly a feminist book. There's a passage where Jane basically says, I don't think it's fair that women are not allowed to live as broad a life as men are. Whereas Daphne du Maurier in Rebecca kinda doesn't go there. I call Rebecca a feminine novel, quite intentionally, as opposed to a feminist novel, because I think it is dealing with women's issues, but it's not necessarily doing it in a way that, it's not in an unfeminist way, but it's a way that feminism is just not really relevant to. It's sort of the things you need to do before feminism. Jane stands up for what she is right and will speak truth to power when she thinks the power is wrong. Whereas, and that's great if you could do that, but like sometimes you can't even go downstairs to your own party. and this is why I actually like Rebecca better than Jane Eyre, much though I love Jane Eyre. It's sort of celebrating and providing hope for like those really small things that become so hard when you have social anxiety. And then perhaps relating to feminism, I think it's interesting how both of these stories do obliquely discuss sexual topics, and they're both fairly anti-sex. With Bertha Mason, I think you have to look for it, but with Rebecca de Winter, it's very clear that their sexual appetite is part of the way that we know that they're evil. And Jack Flavel is kind of flirtatious and occasionally overtly sexual in front of Mrs. de Winter, and that's actually the first inkling we get that Rebecca was maybe not a great person because her cousin is this, like, person. And then when we learn about Mr. Rochester's past, when he had all of these mistresses, he has a sexual relationship with them, which is, we're clearly meant to understand, is not as good as the primarily emotional and then sexual relationship that he has with Jane. And also his interactions with Blanche Ingram, which are somewhat sexy and flirtatious, are not good. They are presented as hollow, unlike the sort of aspirational couple in Mrs. de Winter's view, which is Beatrice and Giles, who are kind of unsexed. Mrs. de Winter thinks about how nice it would be to be 45 and like have already had your children and have a spouse that you can just sort of be comfortable with and go to cricket matches together. And then one thing that I finally picked up on after reading Rebecca maybe 6 or 7 times, I think Rebecca does really reward you the more times you read it, is that Maxim and Mrs. de Winter don't share a bed. They share a bedroom, but they sleep in twin beds. She talks about, like, she looks over at Maxim's bed, whereas Rebecca in her room has a double bed. And none of this is directly stated, but I think from the information that we're given, I at least have decided to piece together that Mrs. de Winter thought that Maxim and Rebecca were sharing a bed. In one of her fantasies, she imagines them in the room together and he's brushing her hair. So this is clearly a room that is both of their space in her mind, even though it's not in terms of the artifacts that are still there. So in her mind, at first at least, Rebecca and Maxim are sharing a bed. He's not sharing a bed with her, which means he doesn't like her as much. But once we learn that Maxim did not like Rebecca and he killed her, the assumption has to change to that Maxim was actually not even sleeping in the same room with Rebecca at all. He was sleeping in another room. So the fact that he is sleeping with Mrs. de Winter in the same room means that, like, there is more intimacy there than he had with Rebecca. Now I want to talk about the endings for a bit, because I think these are one of the other points where you can really tell that these books were written 100 years apart. And like so many things in these two books, a lot of the key points are the same, but it's the little details that make the difference. So in both instances, our couples get to be married, they get to be together, and the house burns down. Now in Jane Eyre, you have a restoration of the gentry. Even though Thornfield has burned down, Mr. Rochester still has another, like, decent house that he can go live in. And then Jane re-enters his life with all of this money. And it's actually sort of implied that Jane has always been part of the gentry because she's always had this uncle who was rich and would have taken care of her if he had been able to find her. Whereas in Rebecca, when the ancestral home is lost, they don't have anywhere else to go. They don't set up a new establishment and continue this gentry lifestyle. They actually kind of go back to the way Mrs. de Winter was living at the beginning of the book, which is moving around from hotel to hotel. They presumably still have sufficient income to live off of, but they don't have an estate. This sort of decline of the gentry is foreshadowed in the scene on the beach where Maxim and goes out, like, on a boat, and they find Rebecca's boat and they bring it up. Mrs. de Winter doesn't, when she's up on the cliffs, she talks to another woman who doesn't realize that she is the mistress of Manderley, and she says, like, oh, I guess that beach over there is private and we can't go on it. You know, I think one day, like, all of these big houses are going to be knocked down and the plot will be split up into, like, private bungalows for, you know, normal people. And so that's a big difference from the 1840s to the 1930s. And I think what's really interesting is that Daphne du Maurier is a member of the gentry, while Charlotte Bronte was a member of the middle class and not the particularly high middle class. So it's interesting that in Charlotte's ending, the people end up living this life that she will never have, and in Daphne's ending, she's maybe expressing a bit of fear for her future life. Now, to respond to a couple of specific things Katie brought up, one of them was that she liked Mr. Rochester more than Maxim, and she wasn't sure if that was because she read Rebecca when she was older. I genuinely don't remember which of these books I read first. I was about to say I think it might have been Jane Eyre, but as I was about to say that, I was like, no, maybe not. So I really just don't remember. But it was around the same time. It was pretty close. I was like 16, 17, 18, somewhere around there. And I also like Mr. Rochester more than Maxim. There are certainly some problems with Mr. Rochester, but Maxim is just like so unbelievably selfish. He never tells his wife, I love you, for like the whole first 2/3 of the book, and she's miserable basically entirely on that account. I think if he had said I love you in the first couple of chapters, or at least when they got married, the book wouldn't have happened, because Mrs. De Winter would have been much less miserable. Katie also said that Jane is much more self-analytic than Mrs. De Winter, and I definitely agree with that. I think that that is a reflection of modernism creeping into Daphne du Maurier's writing. Daphne du Maurier's book is not like a fully modernist book in the vein of, say, Virginia Woolf, but it has been influenced by that writing. So Jane Eyre will tell you what's happening, how she feels about things, her opinions on what's happening, and on herself, and she is reasonably good at analyzing her own reactions to things. Mrs. De Winter is not as good at this, and so the character analysis falls on the reader as opposed to on the protagonist. And the more times you read Rebecca, the more clear these things will become. So, for example, I don't remember how long after, but it's maybe a chapter or two after Maxim reveals that he murdered Rebecca. There is a very long lunch scene with Colonel Julian, which is almost entirely dialogue. And I spent so long, for the first, 5 times I read that book, I was like, oh my god, this scene is so boring, when will it end? But I think it's actually really important that that scene is so dialogue heavy, because everything before it, there's been little bits of dialogue, but the book is mainly happening inside the main character's head. The external events are secondary to what she is thinking and often what she's fantasizing about. And that's because she doesn't have any self-confidence, because she doesn't think that Maxim loves her. So when she finds out that he actually does love her and that she is in some ways better than Rebecca, she gets all of that self-confidence, and she doesn't need to live inside of her head. She can live in the real world. And then Katie closed her video by asking if any of us had recommendations on further Daphne du Mauriers to read, and boy do I. I have read 4 other Daphne du Mauriers. They are Frenchman's Creek, The House on the Strand, The Infernal World of Branwell, Bronte, and My Cousin Rachel. Frenchman's Creek I didn't think was particularly good. She describes it as the only romance she ever wrote, and I agree with her, at least from what I've read so far, and I think it's less good. Then House on the Strand I did enjoy, not quite as much as the other books I'm about to mention. It's coming from quite a different place. She wrote this much later in her career. She wrote it in the 1960s, and it is set in the 1960s. So the characters feel more, they don't feel more gritty, because I think there is definitely some grit in one of the ones I'm about to mention, but they feel maybe more acidic. I think that's the word I want. So The House on the Strand is interesting, but it's not particularly like Rebecca. Then there's The Infernal World of Branwell Bronte, which is a biography of Branwell Bronte. So if you had any doubts about the Bronte's influence on Daphne du Maurier, this should dispel any of those. It is really a biography of him, and not so much a reflection on how the Brontes have influenced her work. So you really have to read into it a bit if you want to understand that. I do think it's interesting, though, that Daphne du Maurier is from Cornwall. You can tell she really loves Cornwall. I think all of her books are set in Cornwall. It's a bit like Wessex for Thomas Hardy. The Brontes, they lived in Yorkshire and their father was Irish, but their mother and their aunt who raised them are both from Cornwall. And I think she gets a little thrill of delight whenever she can mention that something about Cornish customs that Mama and Aunt Branwell brought to the Bronte family. And then My Cousin Rachel, I think, is Daphne du Maurier's second best book behind Rebecca. I think a lot of people feel that way. And part of that is because it is really good. And part of that is because it's very similar to Rebecca. I think a lot of people read Rebecca and My Cousin Rachel first, and then they go read other Daphne du Mauriers, expecting them to be as similar as these books are to each other, and are somewhat disappointed that they are not. Katie mentioned how you can read The Tenant of Wildfell Hall as a gender-flipped version of Jane Eyre. I kind of think you can read My Cousin Rachel as a gender-flipped version of Rebecca. My Cousin Rachel is kind of like if you took all of the types of characters and social statuses and character traits of the main characters of Rebecca and shook them up and then put them into new characters, you would get My Cousin Rachel. So in this book, you've got a young man, and he's got the money and the house and the economic status, and he gets sort of beguiled by an older woman. But much like how Mrs. De Winter doesn't really know how to socially behave in this new upper-class setting that she finds herself in, Philip, the main character of My Cousin Rachel, doesn't really know how to behave in the world of women because he didn't really know his mother, and he's raised by his bachelor uncle, so he's lived in a very masculine world, and he gets completely thrown off by having a woman in the vicinity. And I do briefly want to talk about film adaptations of Rebecca and of My Cousin Rachel. As far as I know, they've each gotten two, one in the black and white era, 30s, 40s, and then two more recent ones. So Alfred Hitchcock was actually a really big fan of Daphne du Maurier. One of his most famous films, The Birds, is based on a Daphne du Maurier short story, and he also adapted Rebecca for film. Now, I actually don't really like this adaptation. It's decent to watch in and of itself, but as an adaptation, it really fails. The main problem was because of the Hays Code, they were not allowed to actually tell the story. In the Hays Code, you were not allowed to show someone murdering their spouse and getting away with it, which is the point of Rebecca. So Maxim doesn't kill Rebecca in that. Her death is an accident, which just makes this story really different. The main characters are also played by Joan Fontaine and Laurence Olivier, and they are too close in age, so that dynamic isn't present in the film. And also, I'm gonna go ahead and say it, I don't really like Laurence Olivier's acting. The Rebecca adaptation that I would recommend is a 1997 miniseries. I think it's just a 2-episode miniseries, but they're 90 minutes long. I think I got the DVD, which just sort of played it as one whole film. But it's longer than the Hitchcock film, so they can get more of the story in. And also, the cast is so perfect. It stars Emilia Fox as Mrs. De Winter, Charles Dance as Maxim, and Diana Rigg as Mrs. Danvers. And they are so perfect. Even though I've read the book a lot, I just, why would I imagine anyone else to be those characters? Those are the people who play the characters in my head. And then My Cousin Rachel was originally adapted in 1952 in a film starring Olivia de Havilland as Rachel and Richard Burton as Philip. And when I first heard about this, I was like, Olivia de Havilland as Rachel? Yes, please, that sounds amazing. And then I started watching it, and it was just so not good. I turned it off. Fortunately, I think it was just last year, we got a new film adaptation of My Cousin Rachel starring Rachel Weisz and Sam Claflin, which I think is about as good an adaptation as you can reasonably expect of a Daphne du Maurier novel. Unfortunately, Daphne du Maurier's novels are incredibly psychological, and it's really hard to present the main character's like thoughts on film, but I think that that film does the best that we can expect. Okay, thank you guys very much for watching. I will see you again later.